Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows are attending your meeting. I welcome them in your name. Minutes.
Society of Antiquaries of London, ordinary meeting Thursday, 18th of March 2021. This meeting took place online only. Mr. Paul Drury, President, in the chair. The minutes of the previous ordinary meeting of Thursday, 11th of March 2021 were read and will be signed at Burlington House. The certificates of the following candidates for election were laid before the Society and ordered to be suspended in the usual manner. Tudor Davis, Susan Fielding, Ben Ford, Alexandra Franklin, Alexandra Gader, Catherine Haslam, Earl Havens, David Hoyle, Andrew Hutchison, Alison Klevnas. The following communication was then laid before the Society. Margin Walking by Fraser Brown. And I have to add, it was an excellent lecture too. Watch it on YouTube if you have a chance. Thanks for return for this communication before the President closed the meeting.
Thank you. I will sign these minutes as a true record when we return to Burlington House. Meanwhile, if anyone has any corrections, please email the General Secretary. This being a meeting for the election of fellows, the following are declared elected at the ballot which closed today at 12 noon. Graham Kirkham, Tina Mann, Dominic Maschek, Meriel McClatchy, Griffin Murray, Naomi Payne, Sarah Perry, George Roberts, Anita Smith, Sean Steadman, Tessa Wilde, Rob Wiseman, and Christopher Claxton Stevens. Certificates.
There are 10 certificates this evening, and if I can remind fellows, I'm just reading the shortened version, and if you want to read the full version, it's available on the website. Heather Knight, Senior Archaeologist at MOLA, whose major area of expertise is theatre archaeology, focusing on Elizabethan and Jacobean playhouses in London. Simon Maslin, MA, MSc, PhD, Finds Liaison Officer for Surrey and Hampshire, with wider research interests in environmental archaeology and geoarchaeology. Carol Mealy, BA, DPhil, Senior Research Fellow in the Department of English at the University of Bristol, with interests in medieval English literature and history, manuscript studies, and book history. Alex Mullen, BA, MPhil, PhD, Associate Professor in Classical Studies, University of Nottingham, specializing in the languages of the Roman West. Stuart Orton, BSc, District Commander for Hertfordshire Police, working with heritage partners to protect the historic environment through the introduction of innovative community-led risk assessment and heritage watch schemes. Russell Palmer, BA, MA, PhD, lecturer specializing in the archaeology of institutions and captivity and globalization, with expertise in the material culture and institutions of Malta from the 17th to the 20th centuries. Winfred Scott, BA, archaeologist and properties curator at English Heritage, where he is responsible for the management of the Tintagel Castle Archaeological Research Project. Fabio Silva, BSc, MA, PhD, lecturer in archaeological modelling at the University of Bournemouth, with research interests in the way humans perceive and conceive their environment. Peter Smithurst, PhD, a retired curator with interests in the history of technology, especially in the field of firearms and artillery. Samuel Turner, BA, MA, PhD, Professor of Archaeology at Newcastle University, whose research is in the characterization and analysis of historic landscapes, especially those of the early Middle Ages. Lacey Wallace, BA, MPhil, PhD, Senior Lecturer in Roman History and Material Culture at the University of Lincoln, with research interests on the archaeology of Roman Britain. Robert Wellington, BA, PhD, Senior Lecturer and Decker Fellow, Centre for Art History and Art Theory at the Australian National University, with a special interest in the role of material culture in history making and cultural exchange. Thank you.
These certificates will be digitally suspended in the usual manner. Do please go online, read them and vote. We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear a paper, Early Medieval Glassmaking at Glastonbury and Barking Abbeys, by Dr. Hugh Willmott, FSA. Hugh is a senior lecturer at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Sheffield, where he has taught since 2004. Hugh's research interests lie in the medieval and early modern periods in Europe and the archaeology of monasticism in particular. He has recently published a book on dissolution of the monasteries in England, although other aspects of his work include the examination of early ecclesiastical settlement in Lincolnshire. In collaboration with Professor Kate Wellham from Bournemouth University, Hugh published the Saxon glassworking evidence from Raleigh Radford's 1950s excavations at Glastonbury Abbey as part of an AHRC-funded project led by Roberta Gilchrist. He is now looking at evidence for glass manufacture from other Middle Saxon monastic sites and Barking Abbey in particular. Now, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. If anyone would like to ask a question, please type it into the chat function of Zoom, and I'll ask them at the end of the lecture. And could you please hold back your questions until near the end of the lecture so that they're not answered by the lecturer in the course of the event. So, Hugh, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'll just give a slight, not warning, but caveat that this lecture was meant to be given a year ago, but obviously it was cancelled for obvious reasons. And then just yesterday, I was struck down by my first cold of the pandemic period. So I do apologise if I'm a little croaky. So today, I want to talk about evidence for glassmaking at Glastonbury and Barking Abbeys, but then also sort of try and contextualize that and set it into a sort of wider setting of glass making more generally between the sort of 7th and 9th centuries. I know my original talk said 8th century, but I mean, I'm going to dip into the 9th century as well. And as was said in my introduction, my interest in this started when the Glastonbury excavations were starting to be looked at and worked up for publication. And myself and Kate Wellham from Bournemouth were invited to look at the Saxon glassmaking evidence. And that really sort of set off a train of research that is continuing today, which I'd hoped would be completed by now, but has inevitably been a little bit delayed. So some of the results are still preliminary. The core of my talk is going to be talking about other people's excavations, which is always, as an excavator myself, always a tricky thing to do because, you know, looking at other people's excavated archives that haven't been published can be challenging at the best of times. So we're going to be looking at Glastonbury, which was excavated primarily in the 1950s, or the bits I'm going to be talking about. And then also Barking, which was excavated in the 1980s and in 1990 as well. So to start with Glastonbury, again, for those of you who are not terribly familiar with the excavations that took place there, of course, they've been published by the Society of Antiquaries, so you can go and read all about them. But the history of excavations at Glastonbury is very complex. There's a series of campaigns between 1904 and 1979. And, you know, excavation methodologies were perhaps a little different from the way we'd approach things today. And this is the plan to show you the sort of total conglomeration of all excavations that have taken place over the central precinct area superimposed on the later medieval monastery that you see the fragments of today. So all the red bits are various trenches dug at various times. And Roberta Gilchrist and her team did an amazing job pulling all this data together. Now, evidence for the earliest sort of pre-conquest Saxon monastery was found underneath the sort of west end of the later medieval church, but the part of the site I'm going to focus on today is actually the later medieval cloister area, where excavations by Redford found evidence for industrial activity. Now, this is all connected to the sort of 7th, sort of early 8th century phase of operations at the site, which was founded under the reign of King Ina. So, excavations between 1955 and 1957 in the cloister, primarily in the form of sort of thin slit trenches that were sort of expanded out when more interesting things were encountered, found the first evidence for industrial activity and glassworking in particular. And it's been quite a task to pull together very disparate records, as you'll see in a moment, relating to these, partly because of the nature of the recording of the excavations, but also a number of different individuals were actually personally responsible for excavating the different features and recording them. And each of them did them in their slightly more, well, slightly idiosyncratic style, let's put it that way. But what we've been able to reconstruct is that from very limited trenches, you can see the dot dash lines of them up in the north of the cloister and in the east of the cloister, remains of 5 glass furnaces were recovered. Now, the information that survives from that is very variable, as you will see. So the first furnace was encountered in 1955, and Donald Harden, who was then, the recognized glass expert of his day, was invited to come and look at the remains. So this is one that's been recorded by Harden himself. And you can see from this, I'm talking about the sort of the quality of recording. Actually, it's quite good, but it's quite hard to make out what's going on. But we have a sort of oval shaped structure with an opening and 2 pad stones, and then you can see a section. You won't be able to make out Harden's incomprehensible writing, but it basically shows layers of burning and then sort of infilling of burnt clay. And this is what identified it as a furnace with associated glass working evidence. This furnace was actually re-excavated the following year when a sort of more extensive area was opened up, and here it's recorded by Peter Hart. And the plan looks rather different because a larger area has been exposed, and Harden's furnace is actually lying in this area. And the sort of re-excavation the following year showed that actually a much more complicated pattern of activity was taking place. As instead of just being a single furnace, there was actually an earlier one, which will come clearer in a moment, that had been largely demolished by the construction of the furnace first seen by Harden. And then there was a working sort of floor, a mortar floor, where presumably glass workers were standing and actually working at the furnace. So by compiling these various sort of sketch plans by different individuals over different years, we can kind of put them together into a modern plan that admittedly is not that much clearer, I have to say, showing 2 superimposed furnaces, furnace 1 at the top, and then furnace 2 that's is rather truncated and is overlain by furnace 1, and then a working area. A third furnace was found in this northern area of the cloister, and again you can see Harden in his characteristic beret there, back there again in 1957 excavating it. We actually are fortunate to have a few photographs of this one that survive, and down here you can actually see the base, the burnt base of the furnace. This is a later wall from the 10th century that sort of partially crosses over the industrial area. And again, we have another largely intact furnace surviving, or at least the base of it surviving. This was again drawn or sketched by Peter Hart, and again it's quite similar to the one we saw before. It's an oval structure with a stoke hole and then some sort of working area, some sort of floor, presumably where the furnace could be raked out of all the spent ash as well. and that's a reconstruction of it. Again, not looking much clearer than the original 1950s sketch plan, I'm afraid. And you can see part of the problem you have when you're working on any monastic site is, of course, you've got centuries of later activity taking place. So this furnace has suffered very badly by having a late medieval wall going across it at this point as well, which has pretty much destroyed much of the evidence as well. So these are the furnaces that were found in the northern part of the cloister, but just some very limited excavations in the area of the eastern later medieval cloister walk found evidence for further industrial working. Unfortunately, the recording of this is rather patchier, partly because both furnaces weren't fully exposed. The first one I'm just going to quickly show you was left underneath a balk of soil to show the section and then not fully excavated. And the final furnace wasn't really recognized properly until a much later date because only a small bit of it was clipped. So just to show you, again, the kind of evidence we have for reconstructing these furnaces, this is a photograph of that one that's got that sort of bulk of soil lying across it. So part of the furnace is on the other side of it, part of it's on this side, but you can't really see it in this photograph because of this later activity. But in this section drawing, you might just be able to make it out. If you can't, I'll sketch it here. A thing saying furnace in situ, it's a patch of burning. There's Roman tile built into it, and that's very significant because fragments of Roman tile were found reused in the other furnaces excavated as well. And then just the final one is just clipped by the trench here. And you can see it says burnt clay red. And then this sketch by Radford himself just shows, again, another sort of semicircular sort of section through that furnace. We can be confident that they are all glass furnaces rather than other kinds of hot industrial process because of the material culture that was found with them or in close association with them. Pulling together the evidence of the rather sketchy ground plans, the sections, and the material culture, which I'm going to talk much more about, it's possible to produce a kind of reconstruction of what these furnaces are like. And I'm going to make no apology, well, perhaps I should be making an apology, but I'm not going to hide the fact that the reconstruction of these Saxon furnaces that we have come up with are really drawn very much on experimental and excavated work on earlier Roman furnaces. Certainly those that are found in England, and particularly the work of the so-called Roman glassmakers, Mark Taylor and David Hill, who have built numerous reconstructions of these things, showing how they worked. The evidence from Glastonbury fits very closely with their kinds of reconstructions, even though they are working essentially with Roman style furnaces. So the technology is almost identical. We can reconstruct some of this. It's not just purely based on ground plan from fragments that remain. Many of these furnace structures were backfilled with debris, and part of that debris was the superstructure of the furnace. So whilst the base and perhaps the lower walls incorporated Roman tile, we know that the superstructure is essentially just a clay construction. And there are sort of fragments such as this one, which probably doesn't look very exciting, but got me quite excited when I first saw it, because you probably see there's a circular opening. This is actually a vent hole. It's about 10 centimeters in diameter that's been preserved in the burnt clay. And this is to allow air to enter into the furnace and allows the glass makers to control the temperature of the furnace as well. So there are many hundreds of fragments of superstructure from the furnaces that survive and were collected during the course of the excavations. Now, I mentioned finds, and from almost all the furnace structures were numerous bits of either furnace structure, so burnt clay effectively. There were pieces of crucible, which we'll look at shortly. There was bits of what looked like finished glass that looked like it had been blown, and then working waste. So that's all the scrap glass that gets generated when you're when you're blowing and working hot glass. And this was all meticulously collected during the excavations, and usually individually bagged in these sort of small little bags, but sometimes tobacco tins and all sorts that you find when you look at archives from 1950s excavations. Now, the excavators did their best to provide locations for where they found things. Unlike today, they didn't record in 3 dimensions, but because they were working on sort of long, thin slit trenches, they recorded the location of individual finds by the distance from the end of the trench. So from that, we can actually reconstruct where various concentrations of finds came from. So this is the first furnace we looked at. The length of these bars just represents the quantity of finds, and then they've been measured in from this western edge of the trench, showing the distance from the edge of the trench where they were found. And we can see that the finds concentrations match quite nicely the furnace locations. So this top plan here shows bits of burnt furnace structure and crucible fragments, which primarily, as you might expect, were concentrated over the top of this furnace here, the first one that Harden found. If we look at the concentration of working waste, so the scrap glass and bits of finished glass, again, we get a very strong concentration of material over the furnace and also close to the opening or the mouth of the furnace, and then other sort of distributions of material to the south, presumably where the glass was being worked, or close to where the glass was being worked. So I just put this up as an interesting exercise in how, even though you have very limited data surviving from an archive, you can still reconstruct to a certain degree the original excavation. As to the finds themselves, the most characteristic finds that came from the excavations that sort of, showed definitively it was glass making that was taking place was crucibles. And on the left-hand side, you can see a reconstructed crucible based on different fragments that were found during the excavations in the 1950s. And these are very small vessels. As you can see from the scale, they're globular sided, or I call them globular for a better term. And you'll see why they contrast with other kinds of glass crucibles we get. So they held very small quantities of glass, but would have been sufficient to manufacture sort of several vessels or quite a few vessels at a time. And here's a fragment just showing nicely the inner and outer surface of one of these crucibles. So we've got a nice blue-green or aquamarine glass that's being melted, very, very typical composition. And then the outside of the crucible is also got sort of concretion of glass in it, partly drips of glass that have sort of flown down the outside of the crucible. But of course, this crucible, which is a very high-fired ceramic, has been in a very hot environment and temperature for a long time. So the surface itself on the outside has started to naturally vitrify as well. The clay is actually being turned into a kind of glassy mass. So this is absolutely definitive evidence for glass working. And also not just glass working, but glass working from raw ingredients, manufacturing glass, rather than perhaps just melting it. Excuse me. There are also lots of very, not very prepossessing fragments of glass that at first you might just dismiss as being chips of glass, but they actually tell you about the nature of the glass working taking place. And these are probably more important and more exciting to me than fragments of crucible. So at the top of the screen here, you can see these little blue-green fragments of glass, and they just look like sort of shattered pieces, and that's indeed because they are. But all of them has, and this one's the clearest one perhaps on your screen, have this kind of discoloration. In this case, this is actually an iron concretion on it, and they all have a curved inner surface where this discoloration is taking place. And this tells us that these are what we call moils. These are the bits of glass that have been in contact with the blowing iron, and because they're hot, they actually react with the ferrous material and take on some of those iron salts into the glass. Now, when the glassmaker is making their vessel, you've all seen people blowing glass, working glass. That's that bit at that end of the blowing iron. When the glassmaker is finished, they remove that bit from the glass, from the blowing iron, but there's still a little bit of glass that's left attached. And today, glassmakers often just plunge that into a bucket of cold water, or sometimes smash it off, and it tends not to be reused because of the iron contamination. So these little fragments that survive tell us about the fact that glass blowing is taking place here. And if you're blowing glass, you are making either vessels or windows as well. So it tells you about the kind of manufacture that's taking place, even though you've only got these small chips. When we were rooting through the boxes of the Glastonbury archive, we happened to open the wrong box, the ironwork box, but it came from the same context as a lot of this glassmaking material. And we found a piece of iron only about sort of 1.5 to 2 centimeters in diameter, which when it was x-rayed showed that it was a hollow tube. Now, this is probably complete fantasy on my part, but, just possibly, that might just represent the tip of a hollow blowing iron. There again, it might be something entirely different. You would never be able to tell, but I just put it up there as another potential little bit of evidence for the activity taking place. What I'm not going to talk about today, because I'm neither qualified to do so, nor is it probably my place to do so, is the analytical work that was undertaken by my collaborator, Kate Willmott, on the glass. Again, if you're interested, this is all published in full in the Antiquaries volume. But essentially, ICPS analysis was undertaken on the glass. It revealed that it was a composition of a soda lime silica base, which is kind of a typical Roman tradition of glass making material. And there were indications that this included sort of a mix of materials, so recycled glass, sometimes called cullet, was being added into the mix. But interestingly, there were certain indications that we got glass coming from further afield, through elevated alumina levels, which was typical of glass that's being manufactured at this time in the Levantine area. So we seem to have a mixture of sort of locally sourced, perhaps raw material glass, scavenged Roman glass probably, but also glass being brought in from further afield as well. And we'll sort of see what that might be in a second. There are also more specialized elements of glass. Now, the fragments of these are sort of rare or on any glassmaking site at this date. But at the top, this sort of kind of rather ugly splodge is actually a cast slab of glass. It's about 1 centimeter thick. So it's not a piece of window glass or anything like that. And it's the very edge. It's actually an edge piece of what probably was a small ingot of turquoise glass. And again, this is glass that hasn't been manufactured on site. It's been brought in because of its colored properties and is being used for decorative elements of glass making. The other sort of distinctive feature or type of glass that we find is these rods, these reticello rods, which are essentially just twisted rods of different colored glasses. And again, you can see from the scale, it's tiny. And this is used as an element of decoration on the body of a vessel. So this is not an object in its own right. This is something that's been made to apply to a vessel to add a decorative element. And just to show you how they are used, these are just sort of fragments from Flixborough of similar glass vessels. So these haven't been manufactured at Flixborough. This is the Middle Saxon site in Lincolnshire. But here, just because it was volume I had handily on my bookshelf to hand, here are some sort of body fragments of vessels that have been decorated on their external surfaces with these colored twisted rods. It perhaps shows better in the photograph here than used just purely as a decorative pattern. So again, if you find the unworked rods themselves, it tells you that you've got vessel manufacture taking place, and high quality vessel manufacture to boot as well. So even though, you know, the total amount of surviving glass from Glastonbury was probably less than half a kilo, I would have estimated, these little fragments give us a lot of information about the kinds of activities taking place, what's being manufactured, and that sort of thing. Now, one question that we were able to solve that had always been a slight bone of contention was the actual date of the furnaces at Glastonbury. Bradford, when he was excavating for stratigraphic reasons, thought they dated to the late 9th and 10th centuries. And there were other reasons why he felt, which I won't go into, but he felt that glassworking of this type couldn't be taking place earlier on. Vera Everson disagreed typologically, looking at the glass, and thought that perhaps the furnaces dated to the late 7th to 8th centuries. Now, we were very fortunate that, remarkably, within the archive survived some charcoal fragments from furnace 1, the first one that Harden excavated. And radiocarbon dates on these actually came back successfully, which was great. And they clearly showed that certainly furnace 1 dated to between 690 to 770 AD, so fitting with that late 7th to 8th century date that Everson had proposed earlier. And if you really want to push the radiocarbon date, which again I know I'm on dodgy territory here, you can push it into the reign of King Ina at a 47% probability because of the way that the curve wobbles at this point. But the important thing is that, this is clearly from the earlier phase of the monastic site at Glastonbury. So I want to move on to what we then started to look at again, because when we finished working on the Glastonbury material, the other site that's well known for having glass-making evidence is Barking. Now, Barking Abbey has seen much excavation over the years, not quite as comprehensively as Glastonbury, but the main claustral area was cleared by Clatton in 1911, and there's been various small bits of excavation during the sort of latter 20th century as opportunity has arisen. And two areas that I want to focus on are down here that were excavated by the Passmore Edwards Museum. The first area in 1985, which I'm going to call the northern area, and then the southern area that was excavated in 1990. And both these areas produced really interesting evidence for the earlier Anglo-Saxon monastery that lies underneath, just as at Glastonbury, underneath a whopping great big later medieval monastery. These excavations in themselves are extremely exciting, even if there wasn't any evidence for glassmaking. But I will confine myself to the glassmaking aspect of them. So here's a better plan of these two areas. Just again, as a way of introduction, Barking is founded in 666 AD. Its potential, well, it is, whether it's destroyed is a matter of contention, but it certainly experiences a fairly devastating raid in 870 by Vikings. There's some discussion about whether that ends the monastery or if it continues. If not, it's certainly refounded by the 10th century. And then, of course, it goes into a post-conquest phase as well. So the excavations revealed in the northern area two ranges of workshops. You can just see them in the plan here. In the red, ignore the blue, that's all later stuff on top. And within one of the ranges of workshops were found primarily in a single pit and in close association with a pit, a very large quantity of finished Anglo-Saxon vessel glass. Then the southern excavations, which again found all sorts of industrial activity, which I won't go into, found an area with a furnace and evidence for glass working taking place. So let's start with the northern area and the vessel glass that was found. So here are just some of the fragments that were found. 180 or so were recovered, so it's one of the largest assemblages of sort of early Anglo-Saxon glass that's been found anywhere. certainly outside of a sort of combined cemetery context. And it shows a full range of different types of primarily drinking vessels, but also bowls and that sort of thing. And again, I'm not going to go into a whole typological discussion of the glass, but it's a really super assemblage of material that's still being worked on at the moment. And these are all finished. They're all completed vessels. I think there's one fragment of slightly melted glass, which is probably because it's been in contact with a fire rather than anything to do with manufacturing. And it sparked some debate about, does this represent, residue from glass making, or is it just consumption waste or whatever? But suffice to say, I mean, it is a very interesting collection of vessel glass. I'll come back to connect it in a bit. In fact, I'll do that now. One suggestion when the glass was found, especially after the glass working evidence was found 5 years later, is that perhaps this is glass that's been collected up. Again, this cullet that's been collected up for remelting in the glass working area just a bit to the south. I think that's probably actually unlikely. And I've just put these three slightly unrepresentative pictures of some of those vessels up to suggest why I think that is the case, is that whilst a lot of this complete vessel glass from the northern area is just in a sort of standard blue-green glass, which you could probably recycle quite easily. Quite a lot of the fragments are in heavily coloured glass. So we've got, it looks like it's black, but it's actually a very dark turquoise colour with yellow here. Again, this sort of very deep amber glass. And then there's even fragments of this very rare sealing red wax glass. This is just not suitable for remelting and reforming. If you put these into a crucible to melt them down to make something else, you'd end up with a real dark coloured splodge. I think the feeling is that this is not glass that's been collected up for melting and reworking. It still remains a possibility. These could have been things that were made at Barking, but demonstrating that is nigh on impossible. And I would just settle for the fact that, whatever the origin of these glass vessels, it shows that at Barking there is a demand for glass. There's clearly consumption of glass going on the site, whether it's being manufactured there or not. And that might have an influence of why we've also got evidence for glass working too. So in the southern area, excavations in 1990 produced the remains of a possible glass furnace. And you'll notice I use the word possible. And here is a shot of it during the course of excavation. Obviously, this is a much more modern excavation, so it's better recorded. And the furnace itself is in generally much better condition than any of the ones that were found at Glastonbury too. The reason I show this half excavation photo is partly to show all these sort of post holes and stuff. They're all later disturbance that have cut through it, and there's been quarrying away that's taken place here. But the reason I've put it in is you can see the fill of the furnace. So this is the floor of it, constructed again from Roman tiles, the base of the wall in Roman tile, bonded in clay. And then in the backfill of this furnace, when it's gone out of use, is these banded layers of tile and sort of general burnt clay stuff. And this is kind of material that's either collapsed in or been deposited in the furnace after it's gone out of use. And it's within this kind of fill there's a lot of the evidence for glass working. It has been recovered, but that there is a slight caution in then saying the fill is actually indicative of the actual furnace itself, and you'll see why I say that. Now, when the excavators first came across, I forgot. Here's a fully excavated photo. Again, you can see part of it's been chopped away on this side by later activity. That slight dip there is the stoke hole where fuel would be put into the furnace and ash raked out. It's a bit bigger. It's about half as big again as the Glastonbury furnaces, but it's still a relatively small structure. That's a meter measuring pole there. you know, so we've got a much better idea of the actual form and structure of this furnace because of it being a more modern excavation and less disturbed. Now, the reason it was immediately identified or associated with glassworking was because of some of the finds again. And if you look at this top picture, this is literally on the trench side, a slide of some of the finds that came out of the backfill of that furnace. Now, some of these things, I'm not quite sure what they are. I don't know what that is. That's some kind of crucible thing, but it may or may not be related to glass making. But the thing to look at is this fragment here. It's again, if you see, that's the rim, and then most of the side of globular crucible, almost identical to the ones found at Glastonbury. And you can see there's a whopping great big splodge of glass that survives on the inside too. Now, unfortunately, this slide is all that remains of these finds. These really definitive finds have just disappeared. They were probably sent, in my experience, probably sent to some expert somewhere to look at, and have now become lost and never returned. However, smaller, less impressive fragments do survive, including these three little ones here, which are from crucibles, as you can see, with a nice glassy deposit. The fabric of the crucible, again, is very similar to the fabric from Glastonbury. It's this very high-fired, white, pure fabric. So, you know, even though the sort of the big chunks have since disappeared, they may reappear, hopefully. We have lots of smaller fragments that show that, you know, glass making was definitely taking place here. More interesting, perhaps, are the small fragments of glass, again, being a more modern excavation. There was a much better retrieval and sieving and that sort of thing policy on the site. So really quite tiny things were recovered. And we've got some similar but also different evidence for glass working barking that we do at Glastonbury. So we have ordinary moils. I'm not going to show you another blue-green moil. You've seen one, you've probably seen them all. But the one I have put up here is this one here, which you can see the iron staining on the inside. But interestingly, that's got opaque white glass on it. So that's a very unusual fragment. It shows that they're working white glass, almost certainly not blowing it into vessels or windows, but probably this has resulted from dipping the blowing iron or any iron rod into the molten glass to pull out a lump that it can then be turned into what you can see below, which are these rods of opaque white glass. We've also got similar things happening in black glass, and I use black in inverted commas because, of course, you know, black is actually just a very dark other color. In this case, it's this very dark, murky green. And again, you can actually see these are pulled bits of glass from where they're pulling and stretching them and creating rods of glass. Now, these opaque white ones are square in section. And probably combined with these black ones are being used to make what you can see down here on the bottom right-hand side. These are composite canes made up from multiple canes placed together and then fused. Now, if you look at the scale, that's the critical thing. That's a 4mm scale. These are tiny, tiny chips of very complex glass. And I'm going to come back to them right at the end. We've also got fragments of these twisted reticello rods again. Some of them incredibly thin and fine, surviving. So again, it shows that here at Barking, we've got people manufacturing vessels, at least, possibly window glass, but that's always harder to see. Just as at Glastonbury, there's some debate, or there had been data at Glastonbury about the dating of the furnace, there are some problems with the dating of the furnace at Barking that one can't get around. When it was excavated, there was a fairly early archaeomagnetic date taken, still fairly early in the discipline for doing that, and it came back with a date of 925 plus or minus 25 years, so 10th century. So if that's the case, then there's clearly no connection with the earlier 8th century glass found further to the north. But stratigraphically, there are issues with this date as well. which I won't get too bogged down in, but the furnace itself was actually found in direct stratigraphic association with earlier material. And then of course you've got the glass working evidence backfilled into it. So this is one that hasn't been resolved yet. I mean, one possibility is, in fact, this furnace is actually not for glass making, you know, it could be 10th century, it's something else. And then later activity on site and dumping and that sort of thing has, you know, mixed around the material culture, or potentially the archaeomagnetic date might be a bit iffy. Unfortunately, it's not published, so that it can't be questioned. But I just wanted to point out there's not a simple association between the furnace structure, the glass working debris, and then the finished glass to the trench to the north. It's a bit more complicated than that. The story is kind of still ongoing. There's been further work at Barking, but at present it's not published, so I can't really say very much about it. But first evaluation work by Thames Valley Archaeology Services and then a much larger scale excavation have taken place. And very intriguingly, this evaluation trench in 2015, just to the south of the northern area excavated in 1985. So that's it's marked coloured pit, but I've just been arguing it's not coloured, but vessel glass pit is there. And then just to the south of that, this very heavily burned sort of furnacey kind of structure was encountered, almost exactly the same dimensions, a little bit bigger still again than the one that was also found in 1990. So perhaps when these excavations have been fully worked up, we might get some more evidence for the actual manufacturing taking place. I just want to spend the last sort of 5-10 minutes just contextualizing these two sites. So we have obviously Glastonbury down here, Barking here, and I've plotted on a map essentially an overview of evidence we have for early medieval glassmaking. Now, it's probably not comprehensive. There's going to be odd bits and bobs found elsewhere. But it serves to show that we essentially have a sort of scatter of evidence for working glass from the early medieval period right across the country. But I've marked them in two different colours, which will hopefully come apparent as I go on. But it's worth just looking at what this other evidence is, and then what does that tell us about what we have at Glastonbury and Barking. So I'm going to start with evidence such as this, and this is what I would call evidence for melting, not necessarily production. Melting's different from working vessels or even windows. Melting is best said where you take glass, you kind of just make it soft and then do something with it. And typically in the early medieval period, that might be something like bead making. And we have evidence for bead making and possibly other things going on in the form of sort of shallow, small bowl crucibles. So these are much smaller than the ones we've looked at before. As you can see, this example from Flaxengate, if you're very sharp-eyed, it's actually sort of shell-tempered. It's a very sort of soft, not terribly impressive ceramic. It's probably good enough for melting on a small hearth, but you wouldn't be able to put that into a glass furnace. It would just simply not survive the heat. So we get these sort of shallow crucibles probably for bead making or perhaps melting glass to make inlays or something like that. And we have a range of evidence from across the country of this going on. I just make note that we also have potentially this happening at Jarrow as well, and that will be significant in a second. If we want to go into the 11th century, I know, which is outside of my talk time period, we even see slightly different things taking place. And in York, you've got this really great evidence for not even using crucibles, but just little pallets of broken pottery. So just flat pottery sherds that have, glass put on them, scavenged Roman glass, and then just melted in the oven. So it's soft enough to then work into beads. So that's kind of an Anglo-Scandinavian practice a bit later on. So that's kind of melting. Then when we think about what I would call proper manufacture, where you're actually making vessels and windows, we've got the evidence we've seen of globular crucibles from Glastonbury and Barking. There's also a fragment of a crucible from Jarrow. So as well as melting glass, they're also making glass at Jarrow. probably not a surprise. Interestingly, you always need an exception to prove the rule, but you might see where I'm going with this. But we have a fragment of a crucible base, and there are other similar things from Southampton, and that's a globular crucible base. So primarily where we found crucibles or things like moils from blowing irons, they've been on what we might identify as monastic sites. As I say, the one exception is Southampton here. You get more ephemeral evidence in terms of these reticello rods. And again, in addition to Barking and Glastonbury, we've got these very well-known examples from Whitby. We have them from a tiny chippette fragment from Kirkdale, again, a site with ecclesiastical associations, and then the Barking ones. And then, of course, there are also similar things from Southampton as well. There is some more ambiguous evidence, which I suspect people might argue over what it's for. Here's a collection of crucible fragments from Canterbury, from Church Lane. They're excavated in the 1980s when they were thought to be late medieval. And there is still some ongoing issues about the dating of these. But more recent research has clearly shown they're at least pre-conquest. Quite when is still a bit uncertain, but they're probably 8th to 10th century in date. But again, as you'll see from the picture, these are quite a flat form. They seem to be quite a shallow vessel, and the fabric of some of these sherds is pretty crummy. Again, it's very heavily tempered, which is not the kind of fabric you'd want for a high temperature crucible. So I would suggest this is probably more associated with bead making or melting small quantities of glass for a purpose rather than making vessels or windows. And finally, the most difficult evidence to interpret it are a very small quantity of glass fragments from Lyminge in Kent. These were found in a very sort of well-sealed 6th century context. So the century earlier than what we've been talking about, and you've got some bits of fairly ambiguous melted glass, could be kind of anything, but you've got at least a couple of moils here. So this represents glass that has been blown in aquamarine and an almost colorless example there. And this is kind of the exception that's proving the rule, I guess, in the way of what I've been saying. Now, how you interpret this evidence, because it came from a secondary context, it was found deposited in a solution hole where a lot of the rubbish from the site was being deposited. It wasn't found in a working area. It either represents evidence for exceptionally early glassmaking in England, which has been hinted at typologically. Both Harden and Everson suggested that these so-called Kempston cone beakers, which are late 5th to 6th century, were maybe manufactured in England because there aren't, very close continental parallels for them. Perhaps we might have sort of pre-Christian glass working going on here in Kent. In the absence of evidence of crucibles and other things, this could be material that somehow found its way onto the site in other ways. I mean, this would look very happy in a Roman assemblage of glass working waste. So I just throw that in to say that there is this sort of one example that doesn't quite fit what I've been talking about of being earlier, really, than 7th century. So what I'm proposing is that we have a relatively simplistic model, but one I think sort of stands up fairly well, with the exception of Southampton, that we have right across the country evidence for glassworking of different kinds. We've got evidence for just sort of fairly low technology melting of glass from sort of places like York, Lincoln, Gloucester, Canterbury. And then we've actually got much more definitive evidence for sort of manufacture of complex glass, primarily vessels, but probably windows as well. And that's at sort of Jarrow, Whitby, Kirkdale, Glastonbury, Barking. So there seems to be a sort of division between manufacturing traditions, between sort of low-level glass melting that's taking place across a range of different kinds of sites, and then that kind of glass manufacture that's taking place on sites that are explicitly ecclesiastical or monastic. And that is probably a fairly self-evident point to make. that, you know, the technology, the skill set required to create complex vessel glass is perhaps something that would fit more within the skill set of the church and with craftspeople that the church has access to as well. If I was to get into slightly more dodgy territory, another distribution that you might observe here is that where we have complex vessel manufacture seems to fall into two distinct zones. And I know this is very small data set, so probably an excavation tomorrow here in the Midlands will throw it out. But we seem to have sort of vessel glass manufacture concentrating in Northumbria, and then also concentrating down in Wessex and in sort of Wessex's sphere of influence down in the south. I wouldn't read too much more into that at all, but it was an interesting anomaly when I was kind of looking at this and putting together the data. So the final slide I'm going to show you is this. I'm going to go back to these tiny chips of barking glass, you know, the smallest things I've ever seen, but also perhaps the most pretty. And here's another one. Again, unfortunately, this is now lost, but this is another one of these composite canes of glass. Now, what I didn't say when I showed you these before is that, yes, these have been manufactured, you know, quite possibly at Barking, or almost certainly at Barking, but they're not for vessels. You wouldn't be decorating vessel glass with these, because if you melted them onto the outside of the vessel and then smoothed them into the surface, they've just splodged together. What you have here is glass manufacture for insets. So the decorative glass elements of, you know, more complex objects that involve primarily metalworking. And that's the kind of the point I want to end on, because having just given you a lecture about, you know, glass making in, you know, early medieval England, it's sometimes a bit of a sort of a mistake to look at individual industries in isolation, because of course there's synergies between industries. And what I didn't really talk about, because I didn't have the time, is that both at Glastonbury and Barking, you have not just glass making taking place in those exact zones. You've got metalworking and other kind of craft activities. So perhaps we need to be looking at patterns of craft manufacture rather than single industries such as the glass industry. You know, different specialists have been better at this, but I have to say my feeling is that within the field of glass studies, it tends to be very focused on just vitreous material. But of course, glass was incorporated into all kinds of other kinds of craft working. So I'll leave it there, having just given you an overview of the evidence, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chris. Sorry, thank you, Hugh. Could I ask Chris perhaps to comment, as it's very much his period of interest?
Well, thank you, Paul. It's a nice way of covering the inevitable hiatus before we get some questions on the chat. I don't really have any questions for you here. I just wanted to say I found it absolutely fascinating, a really useful and rigorous review of the range of this material. I suppose the one thing that does strike me is that things like that tiny inset you showed at the end occur in metalwork which predates the earliest date we have for any of these sites. And do we have any clues to where that's coming from, whether that's being manufactured in England or is it coming in as an external manufacturer?
It's probably a bit of both. And that's a very good point about the dating of that. And one of the suggestions with those, in fact, almost certainly with some of those twisted reticello canes that I was showing, is that they're not necessarily being manufactured on site. They're coming in from the continent, and that's where we're getting, you know, slightly different signatures within the composition. But having said that, the Barking Abbey evidence, we've got square canes clearly being manufactured as well. They wouldn't make any sense just for decorating glass vessels. So there's probably a mixture of the two, in that prior to glassmaking taking place, within England, material is obviously going to have to come in either from the continental Europe or from other sources, perhaps closer to home. Because of course I didn't talk about glassmaking and sort of the western part of the British Isles, where there's a much clearer association between monastic sites, glassworking, other craft working, as you know. So it is probably, somebody who needs glass insets is either going to source it from local glass manufacture if that's present, but if it's not, then it's going to come from elsewhere. And again, as we all now appreciate, it's a much more interconnected world, and you don't need a lot of glass to sort of cut up and make into insets for a nice stud or whatever it is.
And as yet, there's no dated evidence for that for any earlier manufacture.
Not really, no, because I mean, part of the problem is that typologically, a glass rod looks like a glass rod.
No, I'm thinking of furnaces and other installation remains.
Oh well, in this country, or
no,
no, I mean that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Paul?
Now,
Paul?
yes?
Paul, could I just say something?
Yes?
Just a quick anecdote. That was a great lecture, and I was intrigued by your map of the excavations at Barking Abbey and the Parcel Edwards Museum, the PEM 1984 trenches, which you've laid out, which is to the north of the 85 excavations. I actually spent a very wet and cold Christmas as a student digging those trenches for Parcel Edwards Museum, and it was the site of the former Abbey matchworks, I believe. And possibly the most interesting thing we recorded in the trenches were the red and blue phosphorus deposits from the match making process, which of course was highly contaminated, and we wouldn't have gone anywhere near now. But it was very interesting to see those trenches coming back after all these years.
Thank you, John. Personal recollections. Now, John Hines, can you tell us more about the context of the finds at Buckton, which is not a familiar site?
Oh gosh, I can't. I have to confess, I can't, because I've not seen the finds. I mean, they've been published by Justine Bailey quite some time ago, and they are old finds. They're not from a recent excavation at all. So it hasn't been a site I've looked at because it is just some crucible fragments. And I don't think there's anything else really to go with them, but that would be something that would be interesting to look into.
Right. Any evidence of trading glass at Barking?
I guess it depends trading in what direction. There's no evidence at Barking that we do have at Glastonbury of glass coming in as a raw material. So I showed you that turquoise plaque that was at Glastonbury, and that's clearly been brought into site, to use in the sort of decorative manufacture of glass. There isn't anything like that at Barking. But again, analytically, because the analytical work hasn't been done at Barking yet, it was ready to go and then shut down. But if we were to find something similar in the signature that we have in the Glastonbury glass, where there's clearly material that's come in from much further afield, that would indicate, again, and I suspect that is exactly what we would find, that it's all part of this connected network.
If there's trading in raw materials, yeah.
Yes, yeah. But if you think about trade the other direction, is where the glass goes.
That's the next question.
Oh, is it? Well, I mean, again, that's very, very difficult to say, because we're mainly looking at the waste. So we're not actually looking at the finished vessels. So trying to, you can't say, oh, this is a Barking vessel, and I can compare it to that site over there where one's been excavated, and they're, and connecting them in that sense. all you can say is that, you know, this glass is probably being consumed on site. You know, monastic sites are going to consume these things, but almost certainly it's probably going to be distributed, you know, in some form into a wider hinterland or beyond.
Another question: how accurate is archaeomagnetic dating?
There are probably people watching who are far more qualified than I am to answer that one, because I am not an archaeological scientist. But I certainly, in the case of the Barking archaeomagnetic dating, I know there were some potential issues, and I'm not criticizing the dating that took place, but the date that's there without the published background to it, is not something that could be set in stone. I mean, it's not like a modern radiocarbon date with its calibration. So, and it's a very specific date, you know, within 25 years either way. So, I mean, I defer to somebody who's more qualified than me. But
do you know who undertook the dating?
No, this is the problem. Again, from the archive, and again, somebody out there might know. From the archive, all we have is an archaeomagnetic date of this and the photograph of the sample being taken. There's no report in the archive.
If anyone out there remembers or has any information, please contact Hugh. Now, very interesting indeed. I've been directing excavation at Chewton Mendip for 10 years with a community archaeology group. There are many parallels with Glastonbury and our possibly early Minster site. I've already visited the archives at Glastonbury. We need to talk to someone. So perhaps your contact details might be shared with Philippa Osborne.
Well, I'm happy to talk. I mean, in terms of the Glastonbury stuff, I only looked at the glass working evidence. I mean, obviously, there's a wealth of other material there that was looked at by other experts in different fields. So, but
it sounds as though there may be some at Chewton Mendip as well. Now, from Hanalka Herald, do you have any half-cylinder shaped crucibles for glass? What maximum glass working temperatures would you assign to the carbonate tempered crucibles?
Wow, that's a question I'm probably not going to. Well, I can answer the first part, but not the second part. Basically, you've seen pretty much what we've got. The crucible fragments are that there are not many of them, which is interesting and quite a surprise that, having looked at glass working from other periods, say later medieval or post-medieval, you're tripping over them when you're excavating a glass site. Here, for whatever reason, there are very, very few fragments of crucibles. So where we can reconstruct them, they have been in that classic globular form that's repeated from Jarrow through to Glastonbury down to Barking. It seems to be a very standardized form. In terms of the thermodynamic properties of them, I'm afraid that is not an area I'd be able to comment on.
Right. Have you come across any other evidence for the manufacture of early medieval millefiori in the insular world or elsewhere in Europe?
That's a big question. Yes. If you're looking at sites in Ireland, in the excavations by Martin Carver in Scotland, we've got lots of good evidence there for some really complex glass manufacture. Not necessarily for vessel glass, and again it connects back to my final point. It's as much for making decorative insets and mounts and that sort of thing, but there's far more evidence in the tradition of the insular Irish church of this kind of thing going on, far better than we've got in England, I'm afraid. So yes.
And now, in answer to your question, Mike Hayworth, the Archaeomag date was undertaken by the EH Ancient Monuments Lab.
Oh, well.
So there should be an AM Lab report waiting to be fished out of the archive. Philippa Osborne just confirming it's the furnace and glassmaking that they have at Chewton Mendip. So,
Well.
and contact details will be sorted out by Danielle. So I think that's all the questions we have, except I've got one at the end. The globular crucibles, Glastonbury and elsewhere, in the white clay fabric, look like quite sophisticated thrown vessels. Any thoughts as to where they came from and why they are as they are?
Again, I can answer the second part better than the first part. Because of the high temperatures, I mean, we're talking, again, it's a slight guesstimate, but I mean, you're talking about them having to withstand for a prolonged period of time, you know, between 800, 1,000 degrees, you know, poor clay with lots of inclusions that's handmade, it's not going to survive. So you need well-made crucible. Again, I know it's dangerous to draw analogies between periods, but if you look at late medieval, post-medieval literature, there's lots of sort of information about how important making the crucible is. And of course, if you get that wrong, then you waste all the glass if it bursts in the kiln, in the furnace. So, you know, without a doubt, if you're making high quality vessels in any period, you need decent crucibles that are going to sort of stand. Where they came from, again, we don't have any direct evidence for that. I mean, I would assume that they're not made on site because, you know, they're going to be specific clays that aren't necessarily available in Barking or that sort of thing. So, or at least the clay has come in from somewhere else.
They look like specialist vessels made, as you say, both for the nature of the clay and the fact that such an elaborate thrown vessel is perhaps going to be from somewhere other than Barking or even Glastonbury, you know, as though they're perhaps imported from the near continent or
that's
whatever.
entirely possible. That's entirely, but they're the most important element of the glassmaking process, because if that goes wrong, everything goes wrong. So I could well appreciate that they would be, you know, concerned about bringing them in and getting the best possible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for a fascinating, thought-provoking survey of early glass working in England. So many thanks again from us all. Now, at the close, I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 8th of April, 2021, when we will hear a paper, The Viking Phenomenon, Paradigms, Parameters and Progress, by Professor Neil Price, FSA. The meeting